Fantastic. Well, my name is Vasilios Kosmakos, and this is Ronan Hart. Today is November 1st, 11:05 a.m. And who do we have the pleasure of speaking with today?
This is Henry Dean, D-E-A-N, Dean.
All right, what's a pleasure, Mr. Dean. So we're just going to start off with asking you some questions. And first and foremost, right, where were you born? And if you can tell us about your family, that would be great.
Okay, I was born in Abilene, Texas in 1947. And I was the result of a World War II romance. My mother was in the Army Air Corps as a nurse, second lieutenant, and my father was in the service. And they met, got married, had me in 1947. So I'm literally the result of the World War II romance they had.
So of course you become very much involved in environmental conservation, water conservation in your career, but during your education and when you were younger, did you have a lot of affinity for the outdoors or take interest in that kind of thing?
Well, it's interesting. When I was born in 1947, I spent my first 15 years in Abilene, Texas, and I was just a typical kid growing up in the 50s, playing, baseball and football out in the backyard and riding my bike. I really didn't have a lot of literally any interest beyond that to speak of other than going to school. So in 1962, my mother announced to my sister and me that we were moving back to her home state of Iowa, where she grew up on an Iowa farm in the Depression. And so I went to high school and college at the University of Iowa. In other words, I went to high school in Iowa City, Iowa, at City High. And then I went to the University of Iowa. And this is really what started what became a career in Florida water policy and environmental policy. And it was my undergraduate teachings, which oddly enough, I majored in economics with a bachelor in business administration. And you might say, well, that's strange. But what happened is, when I got my bachelor's degree in the bachelor's in business administration and with a major in economics, macroeconomics, I didn't care much about learning how you run a manufacturing plant. What I cared about was, how did the national economy operate? How did we, as a nation, how did the economy run? And all of the things that involves with macroeconomics. So, and I started reading a lot of economic material and philosophy, like Ricardo and Hume and Locke and Adam Smith and Henry George, The Theory of Rent, all aimed at trying to figure out how a society operates when you try to balance government regulations with the concept of private property rights. And that literally started in undergraduate work at the University of Iowa with what I've just tried to explain in so many words. But then two things happened during my senior year in college. Number one, I realized it was extremely cold in Iowa compared to Texas. And I wanted to move south, back to my roots, if you will. And so A, I wanted to move south, and B, I wanted to go to law school. And so I applied to Florida State University to law school in Tallahassee. No offense to all my Gator fans, but nevertheless, I came down to Tallahassee actually 50 years ago in September of 71. And I started law school, and still in the back of my mind, I had this sort of curiosity about how you balance capitalism, free markets, with the public interest, the role of government, if you will. And while in law school, I met a fascinating professor named Gil Fennell, who oddly enough was also from West Texas, not Abilene, but another small town. And we hit it off real well, given our background, both of us being from West Texas. And he was an extremely brilliant professor. He was the youngest person to head up the the largest bank in Dallas, Texas at the time. He was the chief trust officer and the youngest that had ever been. And then he was a concert pianist on top of that. So you can imagine he was a brilliance. And so, in fact, his high school classmate was Larry McMurtry, who wrote Lonesome Dove and Last Picture Show. So he and I became real good friends. And he basically told me in my second year of law school that the first ELMS committee, Environmental Land Management Study Committee, which had been created by the legislature in 1972, they were looking for a half-time research assistant to help them with environmental legislative policy, anything involving growth management, water resources, natural resources. This committee was charged by the legislature once they were created. They were not a standing committee that would be in existence forever. They were a select committee for 2 years to come up with a report to the legislature involving growth management issues. And so Gil Fennell recommended me to the executive director of that committee to be his half-time research assistant. So my second year of law school and my last year of law school, I spent working in that half-time role for the ELMS committee. And the ELMS committee explored everything from phosphate reclamation to the New Communities Act to transfer of development rights to water resources to developments of regional impact and area of critical state concern issues. All of those things were being discussed by the ELMS committee. And on that ELMS committee was a little known state senator from Miami Lakes named Bob Graham.
Wow.
So Bob Graham and I became close friends. And so upon graduation, I had experience working for the ELMS committee from graduation from law school in the summer of '74. I had met two really good friends, Bob Graham and the governor's chief environmental advisor, Jay Landers at the time. The governor at the time in '74 was Reuben Askew. And so the governor was appointing Jay Landers to become the director of the trustees of the Internal Improvement Fund, basically the agency that managed state lands on behalf of the governor and cabinet. What was amounted to buying, selling, and managing all state-owned lands, including parks, including preserves, including sovereign submerged lands. And so Jay took that job, and then he recommended me to the governor to take his job. So I was sort of lucky that I was at the right place at the right time, that I then, upon graduation from law school, had the opportunity to join Governor Askew's staff as an entry-level environmental aide, advising him along with other staff members on cabinet issues. And from there, I became the attorney for the State Land Planning Division, otherwise known as the Division of State Planning, dealing with all state land planning issues, growth management, comprehensive planning, and DRIs in critical areas of critical state concern. And from there, I became general counsel. When Bob Graham was governor, I became general counsel of the Department of Natural Resources, which was the precursor to the DEP. There was a merger in the early 90s of DNR and DER to create DEP, which still exists today, DEP. Mm-hmm. But before 1993, there were two separate agencies, the Department of Natural Resources and the Department of Environmental Regulation. And I was the general counsel of DNR, Department of Natural Resources, from 79 to 84. And then in 1984 is when I really started my path on Florida water management. I became the executive director of the St. Johns River Water Management District.
Before we get to the St. Johns River Water Management District, I have a few questions about the earlier career.
All right.
Stuff. Yeah. So when you first started working in conservation right out of law school, obviously your background is in business administration, economics, and now law. And then you're stepping into this very technical field, probably working with a lot of, scientists, environmental scientists. Was that like a steep learning curve? Did you have a lot to catch up on? Was that difficult?
I would say that there was quite a bit of learning involved, but I was in a position where I was working closely with engineers and scientists at the time when I was on the governor's staff at DNR and DER, which really schooled me really well and things I needed to know and understand in order to make good recommendations to the governor. At least I felt I was getting all the information I needed. And that really continued on as I became the director of the water management district, because I had a really good senior staff that I let them take care of the hydrology and science. And I dealt as a generalist managing the agency.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So you were working, I mean, very closely with the governor, with Ruben Askew. What was the, what were your impressions of him, his staff, the way he, tackled environmental issues?
Well, let me, I guess, start by giving you a sort of a background to understand that I had the opportunity and the privilege actually of working for 5 governors and got to know them. I was working close enough to get to know each of the 5, and that was Governor Askew, then Governor Graham, then Governor Martinez, then Governor Childs, and then Governor Jeb Bush. So going back to Governor Askew, I can say I'll tell you that Harvard did a study a number of years ago, one of their typical Harvard political studies, and I think ranked Governor Askew as one of the best 10 governors in the history of the country. Wow. And I think that speaks for itself, given the fact that he was a reformer. He reformed the judicial system, education system. He implemented a corporate income tax. He implemented the Sunshine Law, the government and the Sunshine Law. And working for him personally and getting to know him, I can tell you that he really cared deeply about the state and was just straight as an arrow and had the highest ethics that one can have in government. So he was pretty special.
Mm-hmm. And clearly some of that reformist spirit went towards the environment and setting up these environmental commissions. And this time is the cutting edge for that. This is really the beginning of a lot of these regulatory institutions. So did that feel exciting at the time? Did people think about how this was kind of a whole new field of government activity that was opening up?
I think that those of us who were involved, either directly or indirectly, were, I think, very much aware of what was going on, because it was literally, 1972 is really, if you talk to those in the field, and I'm sure you've probably interviewed a number of different individuals in the water management field, normally they will point to 1972 as being sort of the landmark in not only environmental legislation, but specifically water resource legislation, because 1972 was in fact the passage of the Water Resources Act and really established the 3 new districts, because the 2 older ones had been in existence under special act for quite a while. And so it was a pretty remarkable time to be involved in the whole issue of the environmental policy. It was very, I guess, fortunate for me in the sense that really is what piqued my interest. If you go back to what I just told you about my college career, I was interested in balancing the constitutional right to develop or use your own private property, balance that with the public's interest right to a clean environment. And how do you case by case arrive at a good balance? And that's what I found myself wrapped up in, working with the Elms Committee and then working on the different assignments I had over a roughly 30-year period, working for 5 different governors, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. So you also spent time, as you said, with the Florida Department of Natural Resources. Yeah,
5 years.
What exactly was your work with them?
Well, I was general counsel for an agency that was basically charged with providing staff to the governor and cabinet on a number of issues, including the purchase, management, and disposal of state-owned lands. So any state land acquisition for park purposes or for conservation lands, we did all of the work that led to an action by the governor and cabinet to purchase that land. And I was involved directly in probably at least 50 or 60 major land acquisitions around the state over that time period, including Henderson Beach in Destin, Big Talbot in Jacksonville, Guano River Preserve in St. Johns County, Air Force Beach, which is now John D. MacArthur Park in Palm Beach County, Bahia Honda Park in the Keys, and the list goes on. Those are some I remember. A number of purchases in the Big Cypress Swamp. So that was one element, land acquisition and management. Several others were the Division of Recreation and Parks, managing the different recreation and parks, and legal issues would crop up from time to time involving the park system. And then phosphate reclamation, the mandatory phosphate reclamation law in Florida, beaches and shores, anything involved with the either the Coastal Construction Control Line program, which requires permits for any construction seaward of the coastal control line on sandy beaches in the state, and the beach renourishment programs around the state. All that was under the tutelage, under the umbrella of DNR. And there were an oil and gas exploration, oil and gas permitting. If there was very limited amount of that, but it was there in the department. I think that, and the Florida Marine Patrol, which was the law enforcement arm, which is now an FWC.
Mhm.
So that's probably covers about, there may be one or two little dangling participles I'm forgetting, but those were the major functions of DNR at the time.
Well, I'd like to give you my personal thanks for getting a Big Talbot Island. It's a beautiful place. Yeah.
That was one of my favorite. That was one of my favorite acquisitions. That I took that to the cabinet in May of 1982. It's a beautiful site.
Thank you for that.
Yeah.
So with land acquisition, I can imagine, you're dealing with a lot of different stakeholders there. There's the, homeowners, landowners, people are interested in mining, fishing, agriculture. What is it like trying to balance all of those different stakeholder interests?
Well, that's a great question. That sort of summarizes what I've tried to do my whole career. And each one is different. Each activity, each problem, each issue. But I always tried to reach what I considered a fair balance to make sure that I guess here's my test. If one side was deliriously happy and the other side was extremely disappointed and saddened, I thought to myself, this is probably not the best solution.
Mm-hmm.
What I tried to make sure that a fair compromise could be arrived at in almost every project or problem that I became involved in. And sometimes that just didn't happen, and it would end up in court and a judge would decide. So, but that was really the test for me personally.
When dealing with these types of situations, right? How would you balance kind of this idea between justice and progress, right? So, for example, like, obviously, farmer is going to need land, right? Or is going to need to, use pesticides, right? But if those pesticides are kind of overwhelmingly detrimental to the environment, right? It's like, you can't really find a compromise to a certain degree with someone that wants clean water.
Yeah,
Right?
well, that's the whole. That's a huge issue that, is sort of reflected by the whole Monsanto litigation. They ended up having to pay hundreds of millions of dollars in penalties because of their damage to the environment. And we have EPA has regulations, DEP has regulations, and those have to be followed. And hopefully those regulations are providing a level of protection that protects the public from any damage. That's what they're supposed to be doing. And if they're not, the regulations need to be amended.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I mean, before we cut you off, you're about to begin talking about your time with the St. Johns River Water Management District. If you want to just continue with your overview of that time, and then we can ask about some specific projects and stuff.
Yeah, just so you guys know, I'm not sure how long you have this planned for, but I have to cut it off today at 12:30. Just FYI.
Okay, yeah. We should be wrapped up by 12:30.
Okay, but we can always reschedule another follow-up if need be, but I've got to cut it off then for another meeting. But in the meantime, so I became.
I'm sorry, quick, another technical aside. I'm seeing we don't have a ton of battery. Are we gonna need to plug this laptop in?
Yeah.
Oh,
Okay, you can keep going. We're just gonna get a charger plugged in real quick.
oh, all right. Well, so in June of 1984, what's that? 30? I can't even count. 37 years ago, maybe. I think that's 37 years ago. 1984.
Yeah, sounds about right.
Yeah, in 3 years, 2024, it'll be 40 years. So 37 years ago, June of 1984, I became the executive director of the St. Johns River Water Management District. And that's where I really had probably my steepest learning curve, because my previous experience with either the State Land Planning Agency or the Department of Natural Resources really did not get into any specific level of detail with a lot of the regulations that are administered by the water management districts, including both the allocation of water under the consumptive use permitting program or the regulation of construction activity or farming activity under the what used to be the MSSW and now the ERP program that the water management districts implement and operate today. And so that gets into a level of sophistication, if you will, of engineering principles, concepts, and hydrologic concepts and principles that I really tried to learn as much as I could, knowing that I had a law degree and not a hydrologic degree or hydrogeology or geology or certainly not civil engineering. But I had such an excellent staff at the Water Management District that I really tried to rely on them, knowing they would make good, sound decisions based on the science and the law. And I would basically serve to guide the overall management of the district. Now, where I did have a certain level of experience and expertise, obviously, was land acquisition. And so I went on as the executive director of water management. I continued to be somewhat heavily involved in what became one of the more, I guess, extraordinary land acquisition programs in the state, that being the St. Johns River Water Management District land acquisition program, because we basically switched as a state. We pivoted as a state from the old Central and Southern Flood Control District program, where they basically implemented a structural form of flood protection with levees and water control structures and pump stations. That's called the Central and Southern Flood Control Project, which was approved by Congress in 1949, and the local district created, South Florida Water Management District, to implement and operate that program. That was structural flood control in the 70s. And one of you mentioned earlier, there was sort of an inflection point in the 70s where we went from old ways of doing things to a new environmental ethic, if you will, in the 70s. And part of that was a recognition by the part of the governor's office when they were going through a review of state programs. They said, wait a minute, let's not continue the structural flood control projects of South Florida water management. Let's do a non-structural approach of floodplain management where we actually purchase the floodplain where possible and restore wetlands where possible, instead of building these huge levees and flood control projects or pump stations. And if you look at the old project in South Florida and the new process in St. Johns River water management, you'll see a huge difference. Have y'all looked at that? Do y'all know what I'm talking about?
We know about that kind of general shift towards conservation.
Well, that happened clearly. If you look at what happened between South Florida, as I described earlier, in the 60s and 70s, when they did the structural project, the old Central and Southern Flood Control Project, that's what they're having to redo now because they destroyed the Everglades. So now in St. John's, what we did at the direction of the legislature was take a different approach, a non-structural approach, where we purchased over 700,000 acres of both farmland and natural wetlands, and basically have created a flood protection program where the floodplain gets flooded. And we didn't build dams or levees and shunt the water back into the Atlantic. We basically flow the water gently in the St. Johns River from the south to the north, which is a 300-mile span. And during the rainy season, it spreads out through these wetlands. And during the dry season, it allows the wetlands to dry out sufficiently to recreate themselves. But that's the biggest difference that I can point to in the changed philosophy of water management in the last 50 years, where originally we had a program to have a structural flood control program in South Florida to a non-structural program where we made a conscious decision to purchase wetlands and some farms that we restored to wetlands to make the Upper Basin project, the St. Johns River Upper Basin project, what it is today, and all along the whole river, floodplain along the whole river, all the way from the headwaters, which start just west of Vero Beach and flow north all the way to Jacksonville and out to sea at Mayport. So that was the biggest change and the biggest part of my career that I was involved in, to implement the St. Johns River Upper Basin project and then continue that north. And I had tremendous assistance from the key staff like John Henry Hankinson, who unfortunately has since passed away from a stroke. John Hankinson, Robert Christensen, Catherine Manella, Jeff Elledge, Hal Wilkening, just to name a few. All those could go in greater detail of what I've described and sort of see
we're hoping to speak to a few of them in the
from
next.
my generalist position. All those people work for me and they're all brilliant. In fact, they're all smarter than me. It's always good to hire people that are smarter than you because they can then accomplish more than you otherwise would have.
It seems like philosophically, right, there kind of was this transition between, man kind of, engineering nature, right, to kind of more holistic approach where you guys kind of just understood that by going with the natural kind of cycle, things tend to work out a little better that way. Is that an accurate assessment?
It is. It's very accurate and very on point, because really, I mean, what we did as a state 70 years ago, when we had a series of hurricanes that flooded South Florida and flooded parts of South Florida that had been developed by then, parts of western Broward and Palm Beach County, Miami-Dade, Broward and Palm Beach County, instead of recognizing to let Mother Nature flow freely, the river of grass that Marjorie Stoneman Douglas wrote about, there was a conscious decision to build pump stations and levees and water control structures and try to control Mother Nature. And that basically resulted in an abysmal failure and led to the recognition in the mid-90s that we needed to basically try to put it back the way Mother Nature had intended And that led to the passage of the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan, otherwise known as SERP, which passed Congress in December of 2000. And it was an $8 billion, B as in Baker, an $8 billion project to restore the Everglades based on the damage that had been done by the old structural project that I've spent some time describing. Y'all follow me?
Yeah. And would you mind kind of elaborating more about CERD? Like what are some of the main challenges, and then kind of like, I mean, even contemporarily, right, we kind of see that, there's still a lot more work to be done in Everglades, so how did that lay the foundation, and what do you see as
and first, when that passed, were you with the St. Johns River Water Management or South Florida Water Management?
Well, that's a great question for me, because when that law passed, it took two different laws. It took the Congress and the state, because it was a joint effort by the state of Florida and the federal government. So the state passed the law in the spring of 2000, and Congress passed the law in December of 2000. And so SERP became a reality, an $8 billion project, basically. And that was in 2000, December of 2000. And then in May of 2001, then Governor Jeb Bush asked me to transfer from the St. Johns River Water Management District to the South Florida Water Management District to help jumpstart and ignite, if you will, the Everglades Restoration Plan, SERP. So I actually transferred from St. Johns Water Management to South Florida Water Management in June of 01. Basically, 20 years ago, basically, plus a few months. And I was specifically asked to make that change, that transfer, with the assignment of jumpstarting the SERP legislation, the SERP project that had just passed. It was a series of 68 different individual projects that were all compiled in what was called the Yellow Book, which was because it had a yellow cover, and it was about as thick as the Chicago phone book at the time, and gave general descriptions of these different 68 projects. And that was my assignment, to go down there and do that. And I basically told the governor at the time that I would be glad to do it, but only for 4 years. And then I would have 30 years in state government and planned on retiring. In state government, if you have 30 years in with the state, if you wish, you can retire and start drawing your state pension immediately instead of waiting until you're 65. So I was looking at that as an option and decided, when I have 30 years in with the state, I'm going to retire and start drawing my pension immediately. Frankly, it was a business decision. And so that's what I did. But I sort of advised the governor that don't expect me to stay, beyond 4 years, because I'm going to be retiring. So that's why I went down there in 01 and retired in 05.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So that sounds like a huge project, the 68 smaller projects for this. You must have needed, something like an army of people under you carrying all of this out. Was that bigger than anything that you had pursued with any of your previous work?
Yeah, well, certainly the SERP program, the SERP quote program that included 68 different projects, that was the biggest assignment by far that I'd ever been involved in. See, I had been involved in the St. Johns River Upper Basin project, but that was on a scale of maybe a total, including land acquisition and some limited project construction work, maybe 250 million. Compare that 250 million. That's not small potatoes, right? 250 million is a lot of money, but compare it to 8 billion, which was the Everglades restoration. So just that alone tells you that it was, on a much larger scale, and the biggest project that I tackled during my career. So yeah, big. It was a pretty heavy lift.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned that you were moved onto that project by Governor Jeb Bush. Something we've been trying to get at with these interviews that we've been doing is the way that the change in who's governor can trickle down and have these, huge effects on the way water is managed? Is that something that you saw through your time with either district that, suddenly
Well,
with all the changes?
I'm only going to talk about my time in government. I'm not going to go beyond 2005. I'll leave that to people who followed me at the districts. But I will tell you that looking back, and I have no reason to say anything but my absolute observations, and can be frank that all 5 governors that I worked with relatively closely, and that's Askew and Graham and Martinez and Childs and Bush, I think they were all excellent administrators. I think they all cared about Florida's environment. I think they all exercised very good judgment in making decisions that aligned with my philosophy of trying to make sure that that we balance economic development and environmental protection. In fact, let me go back and tell you one of the meetings I had with Governor Askew that says it best. And I think all 5 governors shared this same philosophy. And I remember being in a meeting in probably September or October of 1974, and 5 or 6 staff people, including myself, were advising the governor on an upcoming cabinet vote on an issue involving a dredge and fill permit, if I recall. And one of the staff was saying, well, this is going to have tremendous economic benefit. And another staffer was saying, oh, it's going to destroy the environment. We can't destroy the environment. And we have to, one was arguing protect the environment, and the other was arguing economic development. And the governor said, whoa. Now, let me be clear. Let me be clear so everyone understands my position. He said, we need economic development, but also equally strong, we need environmental protection. Because he said in the long run, you can't have one without the other. If you only have economic development, you're going to destroy the environment. And that's why a lot of corporate executives want their companies to move to Florida, because it's so beautiful and has so many opportunities like the beaches and the rivers and the lakes and all the state parks. On the other hand, if all we care about is the environment, we won't have the revenue generated from business to do the kind of land acquisition programs and protections we need. So at the end of the day, and this is in 1974, not 1994, where Governor Askew recognized the need for both environmental protection and economic development. And he said, not only are they not mutually exclusive, they're actually very much symbiotic. You really can't have one without the other in the long run. Now, wasn't that brilliant in 1974 for him to do that?
So
Obviously, it stuck with me.
so if you can just elaborate on that more, right? So like in your kind of 30 years of experience in government, right? How do you kind of find a balance between ecology and economy?
Well, first of all, I always felt as an administrator of a state agency, I had to follow the law. The legislature sets policy in this state, and the governor and his executive agencies implement it. And then you go down to the next level of water management governing board members appointed by the governor, and then you have the executive director and his staff. So we were sort of, at the bottom of the pyramid, right? We were the worker bees that implemented legislative policy and making sure that the laws are applied fairly and equally and reasonably. So if we did that, and now you have to have, and I don't mean you personally, one needs to have a general understanding of the history of water management laws and the regulations adopted pursuant to those laws to understand the legislative theory behind how those laws and how those regulations adopted pursuant to those laws are going to protect the water resources of the state, both groundwater and surface water, and how they're going to protect surrounding owners, surrounding property owners, and how they're going to protect the public interest. Because that's in essence, if you get into the subject matter of Chapter 373, Part 2, the consumptive use permitting program, and 373, Part 4, the what is now the ERP program, Environmental Resource Permitting Program, the essence of those laws and the essence of the regulations, 42C and 44C, water management regulations of St. John's, that basically directs and gives guidance to the professional staff of how an applicant comes to us and provides reasonable assurance, quote unquote, that certain parameters will not be exceeded, that certain tests will be met. For example, providing storage for storage and treatment for a 10-year, 24-hour storm if you're building a subdivision.
Mm-hmm.
Or if you're applying for a consumptive use permit to withdraw water, either for potable water use or in industrial use or even agricultural activity, that you don't impact your surrounding neighbors with respect to the potentiometric pressure of the aquifer, and that you don't allow any type of either contamination for off-site to be impacted. So our assignment at Water Management was to make sure that the laws are implemented fairly and reasonably, and those laws and the regulations adopted pursuant to those laws really were aimed and still are aimed at allowing development, allowing withdrawal of water or the construction of some commercial or residential activity, while at the same time providing the protection you speak about. That's the balance. You follow me?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, sir.
So you described the attitude that Ruben Askew took towards making the balance. That was at the beginning of your career. Do you think you saw a change in the way that balance was kept, in the succession of governors?
No, I will tell you in all honesty, and I worked for all five that I've mentioned from 1974 until 2005. That's Askew, Graham, Martinez, Giles, and Bush. And interestingly enough, that's, I believe, if I have it right, that's 2 Republicans and 3 Democrats. And they all, I think, exhibited a respect for both the economic development, but also an equal respect for environmental protection, and implemented laws, pushed laws, that recommended laws to the legislature, which were in fact adopted to implement that protection. I mean, I could go through each one, but each one exhibited that zeal, if you will, that zeal for protection and conservation measures.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So we have about another 15 minutes with this. We want to be getting out here about 12:05. But we have, a few things I want to make sure that we get to that we've heard about, such as the Chernobyl Memorial Forest as something that you were involved in. I think we heard about that from Catherine Manila, I think. Is that a memorable project, or do you even know what I'm talking about?
You may have me confused. Did you say Chernobyl?
Yeah, Chernobyl Memorial Forest. This might have been for someone else. We might have got our notes mixed up, but
I mean, if I was involved, I think I would remember the name, and that doesn't ring a bell at all.
Okay, well, never mind then.
How about the pollution problems that were happening in Lake Apopka? Can you discuss that a little bit more?
Well, yeah, I can give you the full blow if you want to hear it. In 1984, when I became the director of the Water Management District, Lake Apopka was a dead lake. It was the most hypereutrophic lake in the state. Hypereutrophic meaning it was so overwhelmed with nutrients, phosphorus and nitrates, nothing could live in the lake. In the 1950s, it was known as the most popular bass fishing lake in Florida. Wow. They had 33 fish camps, 33 bass fishing camps on the 30,000 acre lake. And in 1985, there were 0 fish camps. The lake was dead. There were no bass. There was some gizzard shad that are a trash fish. And so there again, I was directed by Bob Graham at the time, Governor Graham, and then subsequent to that, Governor Bob Martinez from 87 to 91 to do something about cleaning up Lake Apopka. And we implemented several pilot projects to try to reduce phosphorus and nutrient loading and to actually clean up in the lake, but at the same time reduce phosphorus and nitrate loading coming off of the farm fields. And we basically filed a lawsuit against the farmers for their discharges. We actually basically gave them, sent letters of our intent to deny permits for consumptive use water based on the fact that they were going to be pumping the water once used for nematode control and other uses back into the lake. So in 1985, we basically, are you with me still? Yeah.
Yeah,
It's getting low. I need to plug it in. We issued letters of intent to deny consumptive use permits. They challenged those in court. So we spent the next 10 years in court while at the same time trying to do pilot projects to improve the lake. Finally, in 1996, the farmers decided to give up. They said, we give up. We want the legislature to buy the land because we think that we can't reach an agreement with the water management district and stay in the business of farming. Mm-hmm. So the legislature appropriated about somewhere around, I think, a total of $100 million to purchase the roughly 20,000 acres of farmland. And so we then went from a regulatory mode and a lawsuit mode to a land acquisition mode. And we, the Water Management District, the legislature appropriated the funds and we exercised our ability to acquire those lands. And when we acquired the lands with the intent of restoring what were the muck farms that had been farmed since the early 1940s and destroyed the lake, our intent was to create a new marsh, a restored marsh, if you will. And so we basically, once we purchased the land, and we, by the way, when we purchased the land, we actually, anytime you purchase a large tract of land, you do an environmental audit, making sure there aren't any toxic materials or other damaging items on the land. And I think the district paid an environmental consulting firm like $800,000, if I recall, to do that environmental audit. And they issued basically a clean audit report, having taken grab samples, as I recall, every 40 acres on roughly 20,000 acres. But unfortunately, they overlooked two small areas. And the two small areas, they were probably no more than 1 or 2 acres at most, maybe 3 acres, were the areas where there, for 50 years, there had been crop dusting planes in a hangar in 2 different sites, crop dusting planes, and that when they flew over and dumped what you talked about earlier, pesticides and herbicides on the land, crop dusting, right? Y'all are familiar with. They would come back and any excess they had in their barrels, they would basically dump in this one area no bigger than maybe half an acre at each of these 2 different hangars. And the environmental consultant missed that. They did not, for whatever reason, they were negligent and did not find those 2 hot spots. So when we bought the land, we didn't see anything wrong with the land based on our report. So we started flooding the lands to provide a rookery, to provide a waiting area for birds. And when we did that, the water that was on the water, we reflooded the entire area for about 1.5 feet because we wanted it available for wading birds. Mm-hmm. So like white pelicans and ibis. And it basically was very successful at first. We got a record number of species to come for that Christmas count, and I think 99 or 2000. And I'll never forget that maybe in December of 99, I think it was Catherine who came into my office and announced first that week, good news. We have a record number, Audubon recorded a record number of species that have been in the, what was the new marsh we created, which had been the farmlands, the muck farms. And no more than a week later, she came in and gave me the devastating news that white pelicans were falling out of the sky, that they were dying. And what we found out is that there was an extreme level of toxaphene and organochlorines in the soil, which when we flooded the soil, when we flooded the lands, it mixed with those two hot spots and it made like a toxic soup over 5 or 10,000 acres that was taken up by little, microbes and then little snails or minnows, and then the white pelicans were feeding on those, and that's what was killing the white pelicans. So it was a complete disaster. And terrible, terrible disaster. Worst thing that happened in my career. So then we had to spend the next 10 years or so rehabilitating that soil and then recreating the marsh. The good news is today, if you investigate and look, you'll find out that the Lake Apopka Wildlife Drive has become one of the most popular areas for birding in Florida, if not the Southeast. But we had to go through that unfortunate problem that we had, terrible problem with the failure of the original consultants to catch those two toxic sites, and then have it mixed with when we reestablished the water level, creating that what I call toxic soup. So that's the story of Lake Apopka in a nutshell, if you followed all that.
Yeah. Wow. That's very impressive. So coming into our last few minutes here, we're doing this project to try and save this history, this history of conservation, this period of Florida history. Are there any other stories or anecdotes or, just things you learned, findings that you want to, put into the historical record for people?
Well, I want to go back to the whole idea of compromise and tell you one example of how I tried to make a compromise and why I think it works. Okay. So let's go back to July of 2003. I'm the director of the South Florida Water Management District, and the legislature, among other things, had directed the ERC, the Environmental Regulation Commission, to adopt a numeric nutrient criteria for the Everglades. By that, I mean how many parts per billion of phosphorus should be allowed to go into the Everglades from farming. So again, basically a numeric nutrient criteria. So our staff at South Florida spent a great deal of time and effort and research to come up with a proposal that we would submit to the ERC as our recommendation, which we were pretty sure they would follow, not that they had to. And so we had an 8-hour hearing in front of the ERC in Tallahassee in July of 2003. And after that 8-hour hearing, they adopted our recommendation for the numeric nutrient criteria for the Everglades. And basically what that was a 10 parts per billion limitation on phosphorus, but with a 5-year rolling average. In other words, each year we would look at the new 5 years in front of us, because some years may be much drier than others and some may be much wetter. And the more wetter, the higher volume you're going to have, and therefore the higher number of phosphorus parts per billion. So 5-year rolling average. So the ERC adopted that unanimously. At the time, I think they had 7 members, and I think they approved it 7-0. So as soon as that vote was taken and they adjourned, I was sitting there at the desk in Tallahassee in the hearing room, and the most prominent, well-known environmental lobbyist involved in Everglades issues at the time walked up to me and looked at me in the eye and said, "Henry, I'm disgusted that my tax dollars are going to pay your salary." And then she walked off. And I thought, well, I'm sorry you feel that way. And within 20 seconds, the chief lobbyist for U.S. Sugar Corporation walked up to me and said, "Well, Dean, you threw us under the damn bus again." So I thought to myself, well, this must be about right. So each side was furious. So the next day, Governor Bush called me. I was back in West Palm Beach at my office, and he called me from his office in Tallahassee and said, "Henry, I've heard from several people that you did a pretty good job presenting the the numeric nutrient criteria to the ERC, but he said, Henry, it's just you and me on the phone now, right? And he's talking about Jeb Bush, Henry Dean, right? He says, Henry, it's just you and me on the phone. So just tell me the truth. Do you think this is a good rule that's really going to work to help clean up the Everglades? And do you think it's fair and reasonable to the growers? And I said, Governor, let me tell you how fair it is. And I told him the quote from the environmental lobbyist and the quote from the U.S. sugar lobbyist. And I could hear on the phone him sort of slap his desk, kind of like that. If you heard that, he said, perfect, right where we need to be. And I said, yeah, Governor, but everybody down here hates me now for different reasons. That was my compromise for the numeric nutrient criteria.
So it seems like the answer is to piss off people equally.
Yeah, if everyone's
That
equal.
was my goal. My goal when I went to South Florida was to piss off everyone in equal portions, and I accomplished that and came home.
That sounds a little bit lonely, but
Well, I mean, now with I understand you're just reelected to a district commissioner in 2020. That history of finding compromises and upsetting everyone equally, that's been, was that helpful in your new role?
Yeah, that's really, to be honest, that's exactly what I'm trying to do as a county commissioner, and it's working. I'm upsetting everyone equally. So it's for different reasons. Those on each side of the issue, I try to find a fair comment. In fact, ironically, I'm having a meeting this afternoon with a group of opponents to a proposed hotel in Delano Beach. And it's already zoned for hotels. So these people are not going to there's nothing I can say or do, frankly, that can make them happy, because it's not even coming to us. It's already in an area zoned for hotels. Long before I became a commissioner, it was zoned for us. So anyway, but those are the kind of things I deal with now. But same issue. How do you reach a fair compromise when you have competing interests, whether it's water management or local government or anything else? So are we done? Are we done?
I mean, do you need to go? I can go for like one more minute.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. I mean, I was just gonna say, it's that strategy of finding compromises in that way.
Wait, sir, can you put the camera to your face just so we can see you?
Oh,
Yeah, just in the last few minutes. That's one thing to do when you're appointed. That's another thing to do when you're elected.
True.
Is that, are you changing your strategy because of that? Or are you seeing
No,
people
no,
change
not at all.
and
Not at all.
understand?
I'm applying the same strategy because I think it's the right thing to do.
Mhm. And the people of St. Johns County understand that that's just the way things are.
Well, I'm going to make the best decision I can and do what I think is fair. And if I get unelected, so be it. That's a decision people will make at the voting booth.
Wow. Perfect.
Well, I just wanted to thank you for your time, Mr. Dean. It's like, I'm someone that's interested in pursuing a PhD in sustainable development, and a lot of the issues that you kind of brought up today are things I've kind of been thinking about a lot just for my research. So, I mean, I learned an incredible amount from you. So I just want to thank you for your insight and for your wisdom. I mean, I really appreciated that.
Well, if you produce anything, I'd like to see it.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Thank you so much for your time. This has really been a pleasure.
All right. Well, tell your parents I said hi.
I will do that. All right.
All right.
Have a good one. So long.
Thanks, guys.